Okay.
Nobody can hear us yet. Put some turnips over here. Oh, there's people on the way. Hi, everybody. Just give people a few minutes to get in here. All right, we'll wait till about 5 after to see if anybody else is going to join us. But thanks everyone for being here. Okay, guys, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We can let people in as they come in. But I'm hoping tonight we're going to shoot to be finished close to 7. I want to get people out of here as close to 7 as possible. So we'll cover things. There'll be some time for questions, but we'll try to keep it as close to an hour as we can. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, all right, perfect. If you at any time have trouble hearing someone who's farther away, just let us know and we'll scoot closer. We've also got some dogs and some friends in here, so you may hear some background noise, but don't worry about any of that. Okay, let's get into it. Go. All right, so our agenda for tonight is going to start with a quick check-in with everybody. We'll announce or just remind rather about our transplant distribution that's coming up, not next week, but the week after. We'll go through some content about garden planting, some different ways you can go about that. Then we'll talk a little bit about some things that I'm excited about. We're going to talk about mulch, which if you're not super into mulch, I hope this will start your journey into learning and loving about it. We're going to talk a little bit about the fertilizer that we gave you and fertilizer in general, and amending based on your soil tests, depending on the time that we have tonight. And then we have a little guest presentation to finish off. We're going to talk about composting. We had a few folks ask about doing composting in their backyard. So we've got a presentation from Vincent, who is going to tell everybody all about how to do that at home. There's Vincent. Okay, and then we'll just talk about our next steps for today. So go ahead and ask your questions in the chat as they come up. We'll make sure they get answered. Let's get into it. All right, well, I think you pretty much know us by now, but we do have a couple of semi-new faces. Our cast of characters is growing. So we have me and Tapa, who you probably recognize. But tonight we also have Vincent DeGeorge from Grow Ohio Valley, who is our resident composting expert. We'll meet him a little bit later. And then most of you have already met Caroline at our site visits and at I think our last pickup. Caroline is our AmeriCorps this year, working with the Backyard Gardeners. So thank you for reading all of her emails. And then, of course, just to reiterate, this program is supported by Grow Appalachia in Berea, Kentucky. Grow Appalachia does this at many other sites throughout the Appalachian region. We are but one of their partners. We partner with them to give garden supplies out to families in our area, but they also do that at several other sites as well. You can find out more about them at growappalachia.org. So then the major announcement, I think, this week is our next thing that we're going to be doing is picking up transplants. And I think we've talked about this with most everyone, at least everyone who's on the call today. But that transplant pickup is going to be in a little less than 2 weeks. That's going to be on Wednesday, May 4th. And this pickup is going to be at a different location than the previous 2 that we've had. We're going to be moving to Grow Ohio Valley's greenhouse on 14th Street. That's where all the transplants are located right now. It's a lot easier for us to keep them there than move them to the public market. So that spot is located at the corner of 14th and Wood Street in East Wheeling. GPS should take you right there if you put that in. And we'll send another email about that just to remind everyone and talk a little bit about parking and details. But that's where it's going to be. It's going to be on May 4th. Stuff is looking good. Caroline got it all seated. So we're looking forward to getting those out to you. If you haven't ordered transplants from us and you still would like to, let us know. We can do our best to get that order filled, though we may not have everything, but we'll have some extras. So if you haven't ordered transplants, there's still maybe time. All right, so any questions about that? Major questions. All right, let's get into garden planting then. This will be the next thing that we do, hopefully. It's been really awesome getting to go around and see all of your different spots. We felt that we felt a little shift happen last week when the weather started breaking and people are starting to get pretty energetic about their gardens. So it's been really awesome to see all of your different spots and the progress that you're making or not. You know, the weather's been pretty rough, so it's okay if we're all just kind of getting started. So just here's this little announcement. The last projected frost date for our zone for this year is April 26th. That said, just keep an eye on the forecast anyway. Make sure there's not an obvious frost in the next 10-day forecast, but once we start looking at that April 26th last frost date, we can start thinking about getting stuff outside. And that's good, especially if you are starting your seeds indoors and they're looking ready to get out. It might be soon be time to get them outside. So this is a slide just from last time. A reminder to be thinking about preparing your soil. This note here says that depending on the shape, size, soil quality of your garden, you're likely going to be able to cultivate it with hand tools. And I think that's true for almost everybody here, having seen your spaces. And if not, then I think most folks have a plan to do that another way. But again, if you're starting with grass, you can get a head start by smothering it with a dark tarp or cardboard, and just make sure it's sealed around the edges to start to kill that. So you have a good head start before you're trying to turn it over. And then once you get to that point, we've got this little video here. This is gonna just be a little demonstration on turning over your garden with hand tools. So some of you may have these, some of you may not. You can do this with a shovel, and I think most people have a shovel. But we just wanted to share a little visual on this. So we're gonna watch this little video. It'll be about 3 minutes. I'm sorry if it's louder than what I've been saying. Can you guys hear it?
Okay, so first things first, it's what we're going to grow in, the soil. Now, in this allotment, we've got two things going on here. If you can have a look down here. On my right hand, your left hand side, this soil's been dug through. So this is what's called friable. You know, it's broken up into small pieces so that you can easily get into it, you can plant into it, and then plants' roots can go through it. On this side, on my left hand, or your right hand side, you can see that that is called compacted. That's rock hard, so you won't be able to get anything into this, and even if you got anything into it, it wouldn't really be able to go so far because those young roots are very tender. So what we're going to do first of all, we're going to break up this compaction by digging it through. I've got two tools here for you, spade and a fork. Now, when the ground's really, really hard and really compacted, you quite often start with the spade to break it up into decent sized chunks, and then you fork it through after that. So I'm going to start with the spade. I'll come back to you. So it hasn't taken very long to get this far. Look at that soil now. It's nicely chopped up. Lots of smaller lumps, nothing much smaller, much bigger than a table tennis ball. So up the top here where it's compacted, I'm just using the spade, break it up first, like this. And then once I've done that, just get the fork into it. That loosens it all up, and you can pick up anything that's buried there. So soil's going to drain nicely, water's going to get into it, it's going to be easy to put plants in, and easy is what we want. Great, so we've made some real progress here. It took us about 20 minutes to dig through this area, which is about 5 or 6 square meters of bed. If it had just been one of us, it might have taken 30-40 minutes, maybe an hour if you fancy a tea break, maybe all day if you have lots of tea breaks. The most important thing about gardening, especially all this digging, is to pace yourself, so make it work for you, all right? Now, what we've got, the result is, look at this. That's lovely friable soil. So you can imagine a seedling going in here, those young roots can push into the soil, find the nutrients, find the moisture that they need. Plant can take hold, it can grow well, it can be strong, it can be productive. Now, we've taken a few things out of this soil as we've dug through it, and that's by using the spade and the fork. So things like this rock, that's a little bit too big, more useful if you're into dry stone wall. So things like this we take out. Stuff like this though, these smaller fragments of pot and pebbles, I just tend to leave them in there. They're not really a major. They help with moisture penetration through the soil. But one thing we have come across I really want you to know about is this stuff here. There's a plant we'll be showing you in the coming months called Bindweed. It's a little sort of climbing plant with heart-shaped leaves, and it tends to climb over everything and it shades them out and kills them. These are the roots. So they're like white bootlaces, and when you see these in your soil, you must pick all of them out. Now, the issue with them is, look, watch this. If you give them a tug.
Okay, we'll call it on the bindweed, but maybe I would say arguably our equivalent to this, or maybe something similar would be Japanese knotweed. Have you guys had experience with knotweed before? Maybe you can put that in the chat if you have. But you might see, right now is about the time actually, you'll see little red leaves poking up, and they have roots that'll just travel through your garden like nothing else. So if you see those red leaves or roots, pull those out. I don't think we really have the problem with the bindweed in our area though. I think, did you have a comment you want to make?
Yeah, I want to make one comment. While you were watching a gentleman shovel, you noticed that the particle size of what he was breaking up was variegated. And that's a really important thing to understand. If the aggregate size of your soil is all exactly the same, which happens especially when you rototill, what happens when it rains is that similar size, aggregate size cements up and your ground gets very hard. So if you have the ability, you have the tools and the energy to dig yourself and create a more of a variegated soil particle size in your garden, that's far superior.
Hiya.
Then
Doubting me.
yeah, he wanted to get the last word. So This slide is just a little map to reading a seed packet. A lot of folks may already be familiar with this, but I just wanted to kind of flash this up in case there are people who are new to reading seed packets, or just giving ourselves a little refresher. And I don't think I'm going to go totally in depth on all of these, but I'll leave this as a reference for anybody who needs to reference this. The seeds that we gave you obviously are not in a seed packet with all this information, but for the most part, this information for your varieties are in that list of seed varieties that we handed out in your binder. So you should have this information for your seeds. It's just in your binder rather than on the seed packet. All right.
All right, I'm gonna talk to you guys a little bit about starting seeds indoors. Hopefully you guys can hear me. If you can't, someone just type up in the chat or unmute yourself and let me know that I need to speak up. But if you haven't already started seeds inside, it's not too late. The big reason that we do this is just to get a jump on growing things while it's still too cold outside for some plants to go on the ground. So that's really the big thing, is to get plants ready indoors where it's still warm. And then after that last frost state, they'll be ready to actually go on the ground and start growing. And so there are some seeds that prefer to be started indoors versus outdoors. So we'll walk you through some of those examples. Tomatoes and peppers especially, so that's why we're giving those to you guys as transplants. But everything else on this slide also can do well to be started indoors. Whereas some plants don't really like to be disturbed once you've planted them. So things like radishes, carrots, beets, all of those kind of root vegetables especially would prefer to just be started outside and then not have you mess with them again. And then in terms of how to actually start them indoors, we have a little video that'll kind of show you how to do it, and then I'll sort of narrate and walk you through what's going on. Okay. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is fill your tray or whatever containers you're using with a seed starting soil mix. So you can either buy a specific seed starting mix, or you can look up online. You can mix it yourself too, pretty easy. It's usually some combination of like peat moss and perlite and maybe some vermiculite. But it is good to get a specific seed starting mix instead of a potting mix, just so it has the right structure for young plants. And you also, before you fill your tray or containers with it, it's good to go ahead and pre-moisten it. So just mix some water in, kind of enough so that it holds together, but not so wet that you're squeezing water out of the soil. That's a little bit too damp. So once you have your tray filled with soil, you can go ahead and poke holes for all your seeds. And you can get that information like from the seed packet, or in your case, maybe from the binder will tell you how deep different seeds like to be planted. A good rule of thumb, a lot of people say about the depth that the seed is like thick or wide, or maybe like 1.5 the width of the seed. So like a pea goes in fairly deep, but something really, really small like a lettuce or a basil seed, you can sow pretty much just on the surface of the soil. And so once you have those holes ready, you can go ahead and add your seeds to the cells. You want to add a few more, especially if the seeds are older. So if they're not brand new, if you maybe saved them from the year before, definitely put probably at least like 2 or maybe even 3 in the hole, just to make sure that you get some germination. And then if multiple pop up, then you can thin them out later. And then once you do that, you're going to want to label them really well. I ran into issues with this, so definitely make sure you use a good pen that's not going to wash away. And it's helpful to put the date that you plant them and the variety on there, just so you know exactly what you're dealing with. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of the video now, but we'll see it when it comes up. So once they're in there and covered back up with the soil, or you can even cover them with something like vermiculite to keep the moisture in, you're going to want to water them pretty good. But Topo wanted me to point out one of the biggest mistakes you can make with starting seeds is over watering them. It can just cause a lot of problems.
So don't water it like this.
Yeah, this is actually a bad example. They get a little bit flooded, and you can just wash out the nutrients.
The plastic cap of that watering can was disconnecting.
Yeah, so definitely make sure you have a good watering can. And then you can place the humidity dome on top to just kind of keep some of that humidity and moisture in there, but you need to remove it once the seedlings germinate. So once they start popping up, you can take that dome off and just place that tray in a warm, sunny part of your house, and you should be good to go. Yeah, so that's how to start seeds indoors if you haven't done it already. And then just one last note, if you don't feel like buying a plastic tray, you can definitely use containers that you probably already have. So a lot of people use like yogurt cups or egg cartons or even eggshells. Just make sure if you're using something like an old yogurt cup that you poke a hole or two in the bottom so that water can drain out and they don't get too wet at the bottom, because that's a problem. And then I'm going to pass it back to Hannah, and she's going to talk to you about what to do once you've started them indoors and they're ready to be transplanted.
All right, so transplanting, you can obviously do this with seed that you start yourself, or a lot of people prefer to like purchase transplants, or a lot of people requested transplants from us. This tends to be a slightly easier stage to enter the garden is transplanting, if you want to just cut straight to the plant. But there are some important things to remember when you're doing this, and you really want to set up your plant for success once it's in the ground. So the first thing, you don't want to transplant too small. You want to make sure that little plant is strong enough to survive before you disturb it from its area that you started it. So you want to make sure that that seedling has at least 1 to 2 sets of true leaves before you transplant it. And you can see this photo down here shows those first 2 little leaves that come out, usually it's 2 leaves that come out right when it germinates. Those are the cotyledons, or what they call the seed leaves. And those tend to look kind of generic, but then the plant will start growing its true leaves, and that will look like more like what you recognize when you think of that plant. So you want at least 1 and probably 2 sets of true leaves before you transplant. And then they also need to be what they call hardened off, or transitioned gradually from indoors to outdoors. So you don't just want to take your seedlings off your windowsill and plant them straight into the ground. There's a little transition period. And you can do that by maybe taking your seedlings outside during the day and bringing them back in at night, just to kind of transition them so they can build up a little bit of strength and resistance to the wind, and things like that. And then you want to avoid leaving seedlings in their trays for too long, or they may become like this one. They'll get really root bound, and that's not healthy for them. So this is just a little more about hardening off. think we covered that. You can place them outside during the day, not in like blazing sun, otherwise you risk scorching them or causing them to wilt really fast, but in a shady spot during the day just so they can catch a breeze, then they'll be ready to go. Okay, and this is a video that everyone has access to actually already. This is Tapa explaining how we transplant into our prepared garden bed. And so I'm not gonna play it. Is that okay?
That's okay.
I'm not gonna play it for you right now, but I'm gonna tell you that in the right tool for the right task video that was sent around, it's on the YouTube channel, it's in all of your inboxes. In the right tool for the right task video, Tapa demonstrates how to properly transplant a plant into your garden. And I think the main points of that are, you can chime in if you want to. Make sure your seed bed is even, your ground is smooth. You're gonna dig a hole that is more like a mason jar than a V shape. You want it to be round and have plenty of space. You're gonna break off, if your plant is root bound, gently remove it from your container without yanking. Break off the roots if it's root bound. And then you want to make sure it is pressed deep enough into the hole so it's supported. Is there anything else you think is super important?
Yeah, the biggest mistake people make in transplanting is not planting deep enough. And that's easy to solve if you just think of the hole as a mason jar. When that root ball on your transplant begins to grow, you want it to grow into something that is soft and friendly, not a V-shaped hardened shape that it's going to have a hard time penetrating into. So when you put your plant in that mason jar sized hole, then you fill in around the sides with loose dirt, press it down, not too hard, but at the same time somewhat firm. And then at the very end, you want to create a bowl shape so that it holds water, so that when rain comes, you're not having to water so much because it held its water.
And again, you can watch this clip and just see how he does that into the garden in the right tool for the right task video, which is on the YouTube channel.
The next area.
All right, and the other option that a lot of you will probably utilize is direct seeding straight into the bed. So you want to do some similar preparation as you would if you were transplanting. It says make the bed, but again, you want to make sure your soil is prepared. Like we saw in that first video, you want to make sure there's a smooth, even surface. And then what you're going to do is, well, this is one way to do it that's pretty useful, is you can create what they call a furrow, or just kind of a very small trench.
Swale.
Swale.
It's kind of like a small scaled swale. The idea being that if you're planting a small seed, 1.5 times the diameter of the seed in depth, and then you cover it over with some soil without a swale or some sort of furrow situation, a hard rain will wash it away easily. So you want to create a kind of an area below where you're planting that allows water to be held, and that's also why you want to be nice and level. Otherwise, it'll wash in a hard rain, and you'll see all your seeds at the end of the furrow.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that is emphasized in what Tapa just said, but One of the most important things with little seeds and germinating seeds, especially when you direct seed them, is just making sure they stay hydrated. You want to make sure they're watered and they don't dry out, because letting little seedlings dry out at that early stage will almost always cause them to fail. So that's why we do this little furrow to help with the water collection. So you can do it like this. If these are larger seeds, bean seeds, you can kind of just drop them in one by one. You can see where they land, and you can put them where you want them. But with the smaller seeds like lettuce or even some of your radish seeds, that's where you would go with the more of a sprinkling method. You can be a little bit less precise, but you just may need to thin them a little bit later. So if lots of seedlings come up really close together, you're going to pull a few out so that you just have the one that's not competing with other seedlings right next to it for those water and nutrients. Anything else on that?
Yeah, one technique for assuring that your spacing with small seeds is proper is after you kind of twirl them in to your furrow, that you take another finger and you just kind of zigzag around a little bit, just to space them out in case you accidentally drop too many. Another technique is to every 2 inches or so plant a radish seed, which helps mark exactly where that furrow is. And that way, if the plant that you're hoping for, like say lettuce or other vegetables, takes a little while to get up, the radish not only gives you radishes for eating purposes, but it also marks that row. They're like little sentries who are guarding the row.
Okay, wow, we've already reached our 5-minute break. Let's go ahead and take it. We've got a couple of things to cover afterward. We might go just a few minutes past 7. I'm gonna say we're gonna hit 7:15, but let's go for the 5-minute break, and we'll make sure our next speakers are prepared. So we'll come back at 6:45. How about that? And if you have questions up till this point, feel free to put them in the chat. I see there's a couple in there. We will be talking a little bit about the soil samples after the break. Okay, we're coming back. Tapa's so ready to talk to everyone about mulch.
Okay, do we have a slide for that?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, hang on, folks. We're gonna bring a slide up here. I think a lot of this is information you probably already know, but mulch is pretty much anything that covers the surface of the soil. As you have hopefully noticed in nature, nature always covers everything. And that's for the purpose of erosion and also for the keeping enough moisture in the ground to encourage microbiotic growth in the soil. So there are many different types of mulch. What's commonly used is hay, but I wanted to kind of give you a warning about hay. And that is that if you don't know the source of that hay, what we sometimes call junk hay, those big round bales or sometimes square bales that a farmer or someone may give to you, you might want to ask them if they know if particular types of herbicides were sprayed on that hay. Because I've seen gardens where they can't grow anything for about 3 years because they mulched with hay that 2,4-D or atrazine or glyphosate, other things sprayed to encourage hay growth without weeds. In other words, they want a particular monocrop of hay, and therefore they put poisonous herbicides on it. If you get hay that has those herbicides on it and you don't know, and you innocently mulch your plants with that, the residual toxins in that hay will ruin your plant production for up to 3 years. So you want to be a little careful. Of course, grass clippings are there, but again, you want to be aware of chemicals that were sprayed on the grass. So other issue with hay, or any kind of mulch for that matter, is that in the early part of the year, like now, if you mulch heavily as your plants are just coming up, and you come out the next day and your plants are completely gone, it's slugs generally. They hide under the hay, they come out at night, and they literally dissolve the foliage on baby broccoli plants or cabbage or anything for that matter. So it's almost better sometimes to part the hay, part your mulch away, let the ground warm up. And once the soil temperature is up to say 50 or 60 degrees, bring the hay back in again and mulch around them. Okay, that's pretty much my understanding. Oh, I'm sorry, one last thing. It's this photograph on the right here. If you have a difficult time finding a source of hay or straw, or for that matter, grass clippings, the one material that's readily abundant and free is leaves. However, when you mulch with leaves, do not try, when they're in their normal size without being broken up, don't work them into the soil. Just use them strictly as mulch. If you work them into the soil, it ties up all your microorganisms in the soil that are just working on eating the hay, and they're not populating and adding fertility to your soil. So leaves are fine, but don't work them into the soil.
Yeah, you can kind of see in this other photo with the people in it, they have a really thick layer of that. I think that is hay mulch, rather than straw. They have a really thick layer, and if you're gonna use hay, I would say go really thick rather than just putting on a thin layer, like a few inches thick of mulch, because that's really when you get that thick layer is when you're able to shade out the little weeds. Some of them even still make it up through, but if you're not doing it thick, it's probably not going to be effective as weed control. It can still be effective moisture control, but it's not going to help with the weeds.
You can also anticipate that in the course of the growing season, you're going to have to remulch, because over a 2-month period or so, that hay that you started out with 6 inches of mulch will be down to 2 or 3 inches, which is good. It means that it's breaking down and adding organic matter to the soil. But so be prepared to do a second round of mulching.
Yeah, and for those of you who are really working on building up your soil, organic mulch is, it can be beneficial to just help with that process. You want to get more organic matter in there.
The other thing to be aware of is that junk hay from a farmer, say, who doesn't want those bales because they got wet or whatever, is often laden with weed seed. So you have to be conscious that while you're mulching, you're also planting future hay, so to speak, or grass that hay came from, which is not always a big problem, but just be aware that you're reseeding it.
Do you have anything to say about inorganic mulch?
Yeah, the other option, of course, is to use black woven ground cover, which is, it is plastic, but it's a weave of plastic, something like your clothing. So it breathes, it allows air and water to go through, which is great for the real farmers underneath there, the microorganisms, algae, bacteria. Commercially, I think this photo here, no, that's black woven ground cover.
I think it's plastic. It's black plastic.
Not sure.
It's hard to tell.
Can't think, it's got stripes. Black woven ground cover has stripes every foot. It's kind of nice for organizing what you're planting. But if you use 2-mil plastic, which is commonly found and used commercially, it's quick. You have to tuck in the sides with dirt on the edges to keep the wind from blowing it up. But the problem is that it snuffs out the life of the soil because of the fact that it does not let air and light through. And then dust mulching means that without using any plastic at all, when you have an opportunity using a hoe, you draw soil towards the base of the plants. And that extra ½ inch or maybe even 2 inches, once the plant is up high enough, is called dust mulching. And it's effective for keeping the moisture in. And also simultaneously it does weeding.
So I guess really the type of mulching that you end up going with kind of depends on your goals. If you're trying to build up your soil, maybe you're going to use organic mulch. Different reasons to use different mulches, but there's lots of different kinds out there. There's also lots of information on the internet that you can reference about different kinds of mulch. So if you haven't used mulch yet, this would be, maybe consider this a sign that this might be the year to start doing it. Okay, then just wanted to do a quick review of this sheet. This is the instructions for applying the organic fertilizer that we handed out to you. So I promised a lot of you this sheet, and I'll still send it as the whole PDF. But this is just a little bit of info about that fertilizer. Those who got that fertilizer, this is what it is. It's the Mountain Pride chicken litter fertilizer, which means chicken manure. And it's a 3-4-3 mix. So that means it offers 3% the nitrogen, 4% of the phosphate, and 3% of the potassium. And those are the essential nutrients that you would want to supplement in your garden. There's lots of other micronutrients that are also necessary, but these are the big main ones that get depleted quickly that people like to add.
Grow Appalachia's mix is, if you've opened your bag, excuse me, is wonderful. It's aromatic and it's very, very good fertilizer. And by comparison, if you buy in big box stores, although they may advertise that it's got nitrogen and phosphate and potassium, the macronutrients. Excuse me, if you look at the percentage and you understand what you're actually getting, it's virtually negligible. Phosphate and potassium is there, but nitrogen is often 0.016 or something like that. It's like less than 1% nitrogen. So it's good to know that, because sometimes you innocently may buy those kind of products and think and wonder why your plants aren't growing very much. And it's usually a nitrogen issue. So thank you, Grow Appalachia, for providing a really wonderful organic fertilizer.
Yeah, definitely. And across the board, it's going to be a good idea to add fertilizer at the beginning of the season. The instructions are over here on the right. So you're going to want to add it, I mean, as a top dressing, is what they say, when you're just incorporating it into the top couple inches of your soil. You can get tools to spread out fertilizer. They have these little fertilizer spreaders that are essentially sprinkling it over the top of your soil, but you could also do that by hand. You don't need to get a special tool to do it. But the other way to do it is as a tea, as they say. So you can just kind of steep some of that fertilizer in water and then spray the water over your transplants. And when you're using the fertilizer, you want to keep in mind that the area that you want to fertilize is where you're going to be planting. So if you're tilling up a large space, or if there's paths in your garden, you want to keep the fertilizer in the beds rather than in the paths, which seems obvious, but if your space is mostly tilled, just keep in mind that you only need to fertilize where you're planting.
No, that covered it nicely.
Okay, and this is, so I saw a question in the chat about our soil tests. I got soil test results back. I'm not, can anybody else, if you got your soil test results back, would you flag that in the chat? I'm not sure everyone has yet. But if you have, or if you haven't, this is probably what they look like. This is what WVU likes to send back. And it can be kind of intimidating to look at all of this information. There's a lot of details here and it's like an excess of information. Really the most important thing is going to be the recommendations. So we can look at this, you can look at all of these explanations about how to interpret, but what you're really going to be looking for is the recommendation. You can also look at this little table here. This will tell you for all these different things. This is phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, whether you have too little or an excess of these things in your soil. So you can look at this column to see if there's one of these things you need to add specifically. Your pH is always interesting to look at. That can let you know if you need to add something to increase your pH, to make it a little bit less acidic. But this will tell you about those big nutrients, whether you need to add them or if you have enough. And then I think this is usually on the back or maybe at the bottom, these recommendation notes will tell you what they recommend you to add to that space based on the results that they found. And with a lot of this, that fertilizer that you got will cover it. So if you need nitrogen, that fertilizer that you got is going to add nitrogen to your soil. Same with phosphorus and potassium. So just keep an eye out and see if there's something like really specific if there's something that's not nitrogen or potassium or phosphorus that it mentions, or if you need to adjust your pH. But as long as that's kind of the thing that they're recommending, that fertilizer should cover it unless it's way out of whack. Do anything to add there?
Yeah, one thing to add is that if you want to go a little more in depth regarding micronutrients, which are very important, copper, manganese, there's 13 of them. There are laboratories that for about $40 you can send a sample into, and they'll give you a very thorough, very exhaustive explanation of what's going on in your soil. And that's especially for those of you who may be considering the possibility of going from backyard gardening to market gardening, where you're actually growing not just for your own upkeep, but also for other people as well.
Yeah, definitely. And if there are additional questions, if this just really doesn't make sense, our extension agent, Karen Cox, can be reached at this email address. Karen is awesome. You can call her, email her, and she will help you interpret those results. And she's pretty good at doing that. So feel free to contact her if you have any follow-up questions. You can ask us too. We'll probably be able to puzzle through it with you, but Karen can help you as well. Okay, so that concludes the garden planting section of tonight. The last thing that we're going to cover tonight is this section on composting. So I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to Vincent.
Is this the presentation, the live one, or did you download it?
This is the live one.
Match backgrounds, but that's all right.
Oh, that's okay. That's what you pasted. I can switch it over if you want. Yeah, that's it.
Is it a refresh? Can you refresh?
All right, 1 second, guys.
Hello, hello.
You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. We've got a presentation for you. There it is. I'm Vincent DeGeorge. I work here at Grow Valley, doing a variety of other projects. But one of the things that actually gets my hands in the soil, which is something I really appreciate, is composting. Grow Valley has kept a composting operation mostly just for our own farms since we've started. But really with the opening of the public market downtown, we've had a lot more greens, food scraps that we have available to compost. So we've been developing a lot more. I think Hannah introduced me as a compost expert, and I'm going to correct that right away. I am a composting enthusiast and one who has mimicked a system. I did not invent this. I looked online and found one that works and have gotten it down pretty well. So that's all I'm going to share today. And you'll see in this presentation, I am a scientist by background. So I don't think it's too sciencey, but that's the way I think about the problem. So, all right, I've given this presentation a little name: Composting from Waste to Goodness, a story of dirt that is redemption. I hope we have some fun. The things that I would like you all to be able to take away from the presentation, if you like, is that you can compost. It is doable. And the other thing that I want to make sure we communicate is that composting should be clean. You're making dirt that you should want to pick up and, like that farmer had, run through their fingers. Sometimes composting can get the reputation as being dirty and smelly, And I want to make some particular comments to make sure we avoid that. And one of them is the phrase that I like to catch on when it comes to composting: in and not on. We should incorporate our new, especially food scraps, the things that can smell, into the pile, not just throw them on top where they'll continue to smell. Very good. Let's compost. Oh yes, I like letting the 3 L's remind us of what composting should be, and that is smellless. When else do you get an opportunity to use 3 L's in a word? Smellless. Little background. Composting, as you all are probably familiar, is a great way to return a nutrient that is actually still available in spent, what we'll call greens or scraps, whether they're food scraps or whether they're garden scraps, and to reintegrate those back into your soil so that they can produce more plant life. So that's exactly what we do at Grow How Valley. So hopefully it can offset the need to buy some more fertilizer, and certainly use everything we can. Just going quickly, it can be useful to think about composting as a linear relationship. Things you put in and things you get out. And obviously what we get out is this compost, this nitrogen-rich soil, healthy soil. And the things we put in, perhaps we'll be familiar with, but I'll introduce the terms. Greens, which are kitchen scraps. Those are the fruit of most plants, either vegetables or fruit themselves. And those are chemically, the only chemistry I'm going to get into is greens are nitrogen rich, which Hannah has already introduced in the fertilizer part. And then browns are the other big input. Those are carbon rich materials, all that mulch that Tapa was talking about, leaves, hay, straw, paper towels. We'll go through some lists. But the other main inputs that are needed, and I think it's good to know this, are air, specifically oxygen. Doesn't really matter as long as we turn it, we get oxygen in there, and then water. And managing those two things is important. The pile, what we'll call the compost pile, takes care of all the rest, and that's all the microorganisms that Tapa's been talking about. There's lots of them in there. And then the outputs, it's worth noting, we get our nice healthy soil. We also will probably get heat, which we'll see. Compost pile can be warm, if not hot. And then the air the air that it puts off contains both carbon dioxide and water vapor. So good to know. I like noting, though, that this process that can be helpful to think about in terms of inputs and outputs is part of natural cycles, specifically the carbon and nitrogen cycle, which are, again, they are prolific. Life on Earth doesn't exist without them. So we're just sectioning off a little bit of the carbon and nitrogen cycles and using it to our advantage. If we're familiar with compost, one thing I want to stress is that we want to work our compost. This is the kind of technique that I've come up with. We don't want to just leave it be. And a good way to illustrate why that's important is if you consider just browns, again, all that mulch, they can take a long time to slow down, to break down. They don't smell bad and they don't produce any heat. They're just sitting there breaking down. Greens, on the other hand, your kitchen scraps, if you just let them sit there, unworked, we'll say, they can break down quickly, a couple of days, maybe even hours, and they smell, right? And even if we mix them together, just kind of throw them on top of each other, maybe they'll break down, but the greens will still smell. And I want to note that I'm not counting that as composting. I really want to encourage us to turn our compost actively so that we work it. And when we work those browns and those greens in the right ratio, they break down really fast, a lot faster than either one of them would break down by themselves. They don't smell or shouldn't smell. Again, we'll mix these in such a way. And then they release terrific heat. And that to me is a really exciting thing. And it's an indication that the great biological processes and thermal processes are going on. So we want to turn our pile. And I just note here that that bad smell associated mostly with the greens breaking down uncomposted is an ammonia buildup. That's a nitrogen-rich gas. Smells bad. So I broke down managing a pile into kind of 3 steps. Picking up or collecting our kitchen scraps. Again, we do that a lot at the public market, but you can do this in your kitchen with a container. We often have a container you keep in your freezer to keep the bugs away. You just take it out and add things in there. We'll incorporate those scraps into a pile. And then I really want to note, I put on the 3rd step as a cleanup, which is also our setup for the next edition. So we'll think about these things circularly. So looking at that a little bit more, managing a pile. So this is that step of adding to the pile. This is the way that I've used, and it's you can do it on as small a scale as you want, and up to as this is about as big a pile as you want to turn by hand. But I like starting with a large pile of just browns, just mulch, leaves, wood chips, anything that's brown, again, that can sit there without smelling. It breaks down slowly. And then once you have that, you can start adding to that pile. So the first step on here I have is opening the pile. And when you already have a pile going, when you open the pile, that's when all the heat is released. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. That's an exciting step. Secondly, every once in a while, we want to turn the whole pile. Assuming we have a pile that's going in, we want to turn the whole thing. And the main thing you're doing there is adding air, incorporating air so that the pile stays what we call aerobic instead of going anaerobic and getting those bad ammonia gases. And we want to do that every week or so, week or 2, so that the pile doesn't go out. I note that the 3rd step there is adding. That's adding new scraps. I put on there adding and chopping as the little action shot denotes. That's Hannah and I there. It's good to break that peel. We'll talk about that a little bit more. It'll help things break down. You can add about as frequently as you fill up a container. But I would recommend going a few days, 2 or 3 days between adds at least. It lets things settle from when you last added. But again, every time you add, you don't need to turn the whole pile. That can be a lot of turning. So yeah. And then don't forget to close your pile. And we'll talk more about that. Make it look neat and keep the pests away. Yeah, so you can turn the pile less frequently than you add. But when you, excuse me, but if it's a turn day, if it's one of those every 1 to 2 weeks, turn your pile before you add new greens. Oh, thank you. So here's what we can look at as a typical month of composting. Just to illustrate, this doesn't have to be a super time-intensive thing. If you're collecting a lot of greens, like we are from the public market, or maybe you cook a lot of vegetables in your kitchen, you can add multiple times a week, 2-3 times a week. And then again, just maybe twice a month, I think I have on here turning the pile. And that's more than enough. And again, I would recommend against adding to the pile every day. Let what you added recently sit for 2 to 3 days before you disturb that pile again. Let things start to break down. All right, let's look at those steps a little more closely by first looking at what I'm calling the anatomy of a compost pile. This is, man, if you look this up online, you'll see this kind of method as a conventional or a hot compost method. Just using a pile. And what it's doing here is you have your ground shown there, and then above that you have your pile. And on the outside, I'm calling an insulative layer, and that's mostly just mulch. Leaves are great. Tapa noted there's lots of them around. And then inside, underneath that insulative layer is what I'm calling an active zone, and that's where your compost is breaking down. That's where your browns and your greens are mixed up in a nice ratio, and they're getting hot, and there's microactivity, microorganisms eating things away in there. So those really just two layers: an active zone where the action's happening and things are mixing, and that incidental layer that is buffering your active zone, keeping the heat in and also keeping pests and smell from getting out. Pests from getting in, smell from getting out. And yeah, adding on here, the steps that we talked about, when you open the pile, you're really just breaking or removing a section of that insulative layer. When you're adding into the active zone. When you close the pile, you're just putting back an insulative layer where you took it off. And then when we mix or turn, we're talking about turning the whole pile, the insulative layer and the active zone, let the whole thing mix around, getting air into the whole thing. So here's a nice picture of opening the pile. We could go kind of quickly through here. This is just fun at this point. You get to see the progress your pile is making. If it's a cold day and you've got a hot pile, you'll see that steam, which is exciting. You can see some good molds and things growing in your pile. White mold is very typical, and that's good. You want some bioactivity going on in there, and you can use that as a reflective time in your life. Adding to the pile, again, you can do this pretty regularly, as many as 2 to 3 times a week. If you're not collecting very many food scraps, do it less. But after you've opened the pile, and so that insulative layer is scraped off the top, then you can add anything you want in there. And we'll go through actually what you can add, but any of your greens, and mix those around in the insulative layer. Chopping it. Let's see. I don't know if I mentioned where to chop, but what you're doing when you're chopping is breaking, like here we had some expired apples, and you want to break that skin of the apple. Skin of any vegetable is its purpose is to prevent it from breaking down, and it's incredible. If you just break that skin, it'll break down a lot faster than if you put a whole apple in a compost pile. And then again, you can see we're going to put the tops of piles back on after we're done adding. So here's the big question. What do we add to our piles? And we can categorize those as browns and greens. And browns are, again, that same kind of mulchy material that Top had talked about. I have written down here leaves, wood, hay, straw, grass. You can use weeds, actually, because compost piles get hot. And if you get them hot enough, if need be, you can tarp them in a hot day and get them hot enough to where they kill the seeds. So that's fine. Cardboard or egg cartons, same with if you're using any other paper, best to avoid stuff with print on it, but cardboard can be all right. Hair dryer lint. So those are your browns. Your greens, and those are the ones you're usually collecting continuously. I put on there is pre-plate kitchen scraps. So when you're making your stew at home, all your onion rinds and your celery stalks, the stuff that you're not cooking with, that hasn't been on someone's plate while they're eating, and that's mostly for health reasons. Garden scraps too. What's that? At home, yeah, that's true. If you want to compost your own kitchen scraps, that's fine. But for commercial growers, yeah, they actually prevent you from using post-plate scraps. But just be aware if you're using your own kitchen scraps, it's the human-borne pathogens are the ones that are dangerous to us humans too. So it can just be safer to use your pre-plate scraps. And then include your garden scraps. If Tapa was noting slugs getting on your cabbage, if you have waste in your garden, compost it. You get that nutrient back in the soil. Spent pumpkins, great example. We use cold or expired produce from the market. If you also happen to have a source of expired produce, stuff that you can't eat even if you wanted to, even if it's going moldy, again, bad for humans, good for compost. Coffee grounds, another great one, whether your own coffee grounds or a coffee shop. Eggshells, they're not actually greens by definition because they're not nitrogen rich, but they do have other nutrients in them and they're great for composting. You can use compostable cutlery in small amounts. Don't try to make a pile around compostable forks or something. It's 50-50 whether they'll actually break down. And again, this presentation is mostly about what I'm calling vegetarian compost. A lot of composters will use manures if they have manure available. Again, it becomes a question of managing your pathogens, and there are a way to do that. I just use spent produce, and it works, and I know I don't have to worry about that. So I do avoid using meat. Post-kitchen scraps I avoid, and then also oils, fats, cakes, things like that with dyes, just because they're not helping, and maybe your pile could support a few of them, but in too much amount, they're going to slow down, if not stop your process. So in general, I don't ask for them. I don't collect them. Maybe if someone wants to sneak some in, I don't have to stop them. Here's a great picture of all the lovely greens that we've added to our compost pile. Life-sustaining, you see, with all those molds and fungi getting slimy and just begging to be returned to the earth from whence they came. That's just for fun. Little Monty Python for you. So here we go, chopping. This is, again, part of the add step. And the thing to do here is just, again, to break that seal and then also to increase surface area. It'll just help the pile break down more. Don't stress yourself out about chopping every little apple up into every little piece. If you leave it in there and it takes longer to compost, that's the worst of it. It'll take longer to compost. It'll still break down. Okay, and closing the pile. This is, again, it seems like an easy step, but I want to make sure to put it on here because it keeps the pile looking clean. It keeps your pests away and smell in. But then functionally, it's also keeping your pile warm. That same way that your mulch keeps your humidity controlled, that Tapa was talking about, this insulative layer keeps your pile warm, and especially when it starts getting cold outside, that'll be important. And then here's a nice turn. Again, you don't have to do this all the time, but about once or twice, or once every 1 to 2 weeks, once or twice a month. It's really good to turn the whole pile and then add something new into the middle of it. And what the turn does is make sure that everything's well integrated, everything's mixed together well. And the big thing is to make sure that air is getting to all the different parts of the pile. Again, composting is a aerobic process, meaning that it runs off of the oxygen that we just breathe in the air. We want to make sure our microbes are getting all the oxygen they need to breathe too. I put on this troubleshooting slide. Again, use your heat. If after you've added some greens, if in 2 to 3 days things aren't warming up, maybe your pile's too wet, maybe it's too dry. And then if it's not heating up in 2 or 3 days, then we have to start tweaking some things. And again, if your pile's too wet, it's hard to draw moisture out of a pile, but you can add more dry material to your pile to dry out the whole thing as a whole. So straw is great. Wood chips can be good with that. Usually a pile will get too wet, either if it just gets rained on, maybe while it was opened up, or if we put too many greens in. And I don't think I actually mentioned in this presentation, and it's actually a crucial point that I need to point out now, the ratio of browns to greens. I need to amend this presentation because that's a huge point, probably one of the most important parts of composting. And you should put a lot more browns in your compost pile than greens. That is to say, as many as 30 times more by volume. I guess that's why I didn't talk about that ratio too much, because I started with a whole browns pile So much more browns and then incrementally adding in greens. That's exactly why I didn't add it. But essentially, you can't have too many browns in your pile. You can have too many greens. Again, if you're just piling up your kitchen scraps on top of each other, that's a good example of too many greens, and it'll start to smell and get too wet. All right. Here's a quote from one of my closest composting friends. Like it did to all these scraps, composting changed my life. That's an anonymous composting friend of mine. So thanks so much for the opportunity to talk to you all. I guess we'll turn it back over to Hannah.
Awesome. Thank you. And before he scoots out, does anyone have any questions specifically about the composting? About this one? If they use this method, can the pile be outside of the fence?
Oh yeah. I'm going to go ahead and just say yes. The worst that could happen is this, Melissa, is there are some animals that are smart and sneaky and persistent, and they might dig through your insulative layer. Your insulative layer, you can kind of shield a lot of animals. And again, it's really only the first day or so that animals, after an ad of greens, all animals would want to eat are your greens. They wouldn't eat your browns. And they might say, "Ooh, there's some celery that I might want to get to in here." You can kind of cover it up just by that insulative layer and integrating things into the middle of your pile. Maybe you'll get a deer or even a groundhog that gets in there. The good thing, who is this, Melissa, is that if it's outside your fence, then those animals aren't going inside your fence where your plants are that you're growing to get those to dig around there. They're staying outside. So I would actually recommend that. But again, add your greens in, not on your pile, and you will greatly reduce the number of pests that even know that there's composting going on there. Thanks, Miranda. I have fun composting too.
All right. Anybody else? Let's call for questions. Okay. Well, thank you, Vincent. That was great, as always. I like that gif of us chopping a lot.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's all we got for tonight. Just our final slide here is just our next steps from here, from this meeting. Again, just a reminder, we're picking up our transplants Wednesday, May 4th. You'll be getting an email about that coming pretty soon. If you need it, I think there are a few people who were planning to contact Caroline about scheduling fencing installation. So if that's something you need and you haven't already reached out, go ahead and contact Caroline. And then go ahead and check out our published blog post. I think you sent that out. Yeah, Caroline sent out a link to the Grow Appalachia blog. So you can read the post that was written this month by Lori, our fellow gardener. And if you're interested in writing a post, it doesn't have to be just like that. If you're interested in writing about anything, please let us know and we'll get you signed up for a month. Oh, and then the one other thing that's not on here is that I think an invitation went out this week to a Facebook group. If anybody is on Facebook, you like using Facebook for keeping up with folks, we sent around a link to a Facebook group that you can join if you want to meet or talk with each other, ask questions, share cool pictures. So go ahead and check that out if that's something that you think you would enjoy. But if nobody else has any other questions, I'll go ahead and let you go. We ended up going to 7:30 anyway, but I appreciate you all hanging in. we'll see y'all next time.